So here's a huge question, one we've been asking forever. Are people deep down good, or are we all kind of flawed? We've been trying to pin down our true nature for centuries, but what if it's not that simple? What if the answer isn't some neat label, but something way more complex, shaped not just by who we are, but by the world that holds us?
You know, it feels like we're living with these two totally different ideas at the same time. On one hand, yeah, we see our limits every single day. Our biases, our fears, all the ways we fall short. But on the other hand, we know that people are incredibly reactive to their environment. We kind of become who others believe we are. Think about it. Kids often rise to meet their parents' expectations. Employees totally calibrate their performance based on what their manager assumes about them.
So, which one is it? Are we just defined by these built-in limits we have, or are we basically a product of our environment? This is the big question we're going to dig into.
Okay, so first things first. We've got to realize that a lot of our so-called limitations, they're not even real. They're learned. They're like these invisible ropes we've been conditioned to believe are holding us down for good.
There's this really powerful story about it. Picture a full-grown elephant, an animal strong enough to literally rip a tree out of the ground, and it just stands there, tied to a tiny little stake by a thin rope. So why doesn't it just walk away? Well, because when it was a baby, that same rope was strong enough to hold it.
So what started as a physical thing became a psychological boundary. The elephant isn't actually being held by the rope anymore. It's being held by the memory of the rope. It learned a limitation that isn't true anymore, and now it doesn't even bother to test it.
And yeah, there's a name for this psychological phenomenon. It's called learned helplessness. And it's not just for elephants, right? This is a huge part of being human. We all have this immense capacity inside us that's so often held back by old, totally outdated beliefs about what we can and can't do.
So, what do these ropes look like for us today? Well, they sound like things we say all the time. Oh, I'm just not a tech person. Or, nah, I'm not the creative type. Or my personal favorite from the workplace. Sorry, that's not my department. See, these aren't facts. They're just old ropes, stories we tell ourselves that we never dare to challenge.
And where do we even learn these things? Well, a lot of the time, they come from the systems we live in. Both school and work are often built on this old industrial model that's all about rewarding people who follow the rules and do what's expected. In that kind of world, curiosity is a problem because it slows down the machine. So we learn really early on, hey, fitting in is safe, but being curious, that's risky.
Okay, so this brings us to a huge myth, this idea that hardship is the ultimate test of character. You know how people love to say that pressure reveals a person's true self? Well, what if that's completely backwards?
Here's the thing you have to get. Adversity doesn't show you who people are. It shows you what happens when their needs become way bigger than their resources. Desperate people do desperate things. And that doesn't say anything about their soul. It just reflects the insane pressure they're under. Survival isn't about morality. It's about adapting.
Think of it like a couple of different ecosystems. In the Arctic, where it's harsh and resources are scarce, life has to be tough and specialized just to survive. But in a stable, abundant rainforest, you get this explosion of diversity and incredible complexity. Neither place reveals a truer version of life. They just show different, perfectly logical responses to different conditions.
And this just completely flips the script on what we think of as fragility. Something fragile, whether it's a delicate orchid or someone's emotional vulnerability, isn't a flaw. It's a sign of a safe, stable environment. Toughness is what you need for scarcity, but flourishing, well, that's the luxury of safety.
So next time you see someone under a lot of stress, remember, you're not seeing their soul. You're seeing their training, their past trauma, their circumstances. You're seeing the coping mechanisms they've built up. You are seeing their limits, not their essence.
So if adversity is a pretty bad way to measure character, then what's a better one? Well, it turns out the answer is power.
Think about it. Adversity backs you into a corner, right? It compresses your choices, forces you into survival mode. Power does the exact opposite. It expands your choices. It takes away all the excuses, and it shows what you really prefer to do when you can do anything. And that is when you see someone's true character.
So this gives us a totally new way to think about what character even means. It's not about how you act when your back's against the wall. It's about how you act when you actually have freedom, influence, and options. What do you do with that abundance? How do you handle that choice? And this is the question that really gets to the heart of it all. Seriously, think about it. How do you treat a server at a restaurant, or the cashier, or a brand new employee who's just starting out. When you're interacting with someone who has basically zero power over you, your behavior isn't strategic anymore, it's expressive. And that's when your real values come out to play.
So where does that leave us? The goal isn't to live in a constant state of crisis, but it's not to live in a bubble either. It's about finding that sweet spot, that productive balance between the two extremes.
Imagine a spectrum, okay? On one end, you have way too much adversity. That leads to trauma, rigid thinking, constant survival mode. But on the other end, too much safety can be its own kind of trap. It can lead to dependency, stagnation, an inability to cope with, well, with the real world. The sweet spot is right there in the middle, the Goldilocks zone. That's where you have just enough safety to feel secure, but just enough challenge to actually grow.
And at the end of the day, this is really the core takeaway from our whole exploration. Adversity shows us our limits, our conditioning. Safety shows us our potential, what we're capable of when we're not just surviving. But it's power, that freedom of choice, that ultimately shows us our character.
Look, the systems we live in, at school, at work, just in society, they thrive when we comply. They want us to believe the box is real. They want us to believe that rope is strong. They pretty much depend on us never even thinking about testing those boundaries.
But what if most of those limitations are just a memory? What if you're way stronger now than that little rope you were tied to a long time ago? What if the box you feel like you're in has a door that was never actually locked in the first place?
Have you ever, watched a highly intelligent, fully capable adult just completely freeze up in front of a jammed printer?
Oh, absolutely. Or, they stubbornly refuse to use a really simple keyboard shortcut.
Yes. Choosing instead to do a task the long, agonizing way because they're terrified they're going to somehow, break the computer.
Right, and we usually just laugh that off, right? We call it being bad with tech.
Exactly. But what if that frozen panic is actually the exact same psychological mechanism that keeps us stuck in bad jobs, or, traps us in dysfunctional relationships, or even stops us from speaking truth to power?
I mean, it sounds like a massive leap, but it really isn't. When we look at those mundane moments of, learned helplessness, we're actually getting a tiny glimpse into the invisible machinery that dictates almost all human behavior.
And that machinery is exactly what we're tearing into today. We're doing a deep dive into a really fascinating two-part set of reflections titled Our True Nature.
Yeah, and the goal here isn't just to psychoanalyze your coworkers.
No, definitely not. We want to help you, the listener, spot the invisible boundaries that are dictating your choices without you even realizing it.
Right, so we're going to figure out why we lose our curiosity, what actually happens to our morals in a crisis, and how our environments shape whether we become tough, closed-off survivors or something much more complex.
Let's start with this massive collective assumption we all seem to carry around. When people act in ways that are uncurious or resistant to learning or even unethical, we just assume it's because they have a flawed character.
Right, we think, oh, that person is just naturally uncreative or they're just malicious.
But the reality the sources point out is that humans are incredibly reactive to the systems they inhabit. We're far more shaped by our environment than our intrinsic nature.
There's actually a really interesting framework used in the reflections to look at this. The author references a biblical verse, John 2:24-25.
Which talks about Jesus not entrusting himself to the crowds because he, understood human nature. But just to be clear, the context here isn't religious doctrine at all.
No, not at all. It's being used purely as a psychological baseline.
Yeah.
It advocates for looking at human fragility, our contradictions, and our massive capacity for self-deception with, clear-eyed compassion.
A stance of being fully awake to human flaws without tipping over into cynicism. Because the moment you realize people aren't as smart or ethical as they believe they are, it is so easy to get jaded.
Oh, incredibly easy. But the crucial pivot here is understanding that people are inconsistent, not inherently evil. We vastly underestimate how much of our daily behavior is just a reaction to fear, habit, and the pressures of the systems we operate in.
Which brings us to the workplace, right?
Yeah.
The ultimate behavioral system. I always just assumed people sort of lost their natural childhood curiosity as they got older. It just faded.
A lot of people think that. But the argument here is that curiosity isn't lost at all. It's actively punished and suppressed.
Let's break down why that happens. If you look at our modern schools and corporate bureaucracies, they're largely modeled on industrial-era assembly lines.
Right, and the primary goal of an assembly line isn't innovation, it's predictability, it's compliance.
Exactly. If a worker on a factory floor suddenly gets curious and stops to ask, why do we attach this bolt this way? Could we do it differently?
The entire production line grinds to a halt. Time is money. Deviation is a literal threat to the system.
So the system is designed to reward people who follow the procedure quietly and to penalize people whose curiosity disrupts the workflow. Over time, you just learn that curiosity is expensive and compliance is safe.
It perfectly frames this hilarious but kind of tragic story from the source about a coworker trying to attach a spring-mounted star to the top of her computer monitor.
Oh, I love this part. So she's trying to use a loop of tape on the back of the star to stick it to the plastic. But, because of the outward force of the spring, the tape just keeps popping off.
Right, and after a few tries, she gets incredibly frustrated and completely gives up, just assumes it's impossible.
And the observer simply walks over, takes a flat piece of tape, secures the star, and wraps the tape around the corner of the monitor to distribute the tension. Solved in 5 seconds.
It is such a brilliant microcosm of the modern adult mind at work.
But wait, I have to push back on this a little bit. Because when I hear that story, I wonder, is this really a failure to grasp basic physics? I mean, we all know how tape works.
Right.
Or is it that we've been so deeply conditioned to view our office tools as these opaque, terrifying black boxes where one wrong move ruins everything? It reminds me of how people react to simple Excel macros.
Oh, totally.
If you write a tiny piece of code to automate a spreadsheet, half the office looks at you like you're a rogue hacker about to bring down the corporate mainframe.
The Excel macro is a perfect equivalent because it reveals the invisible wall we hit. You aren't dealing with a lack of intelligence in either case. You're dealing with what psychologists call learned helplessness.
Right.
The coworker with the star wasn't failing a physics test. She was failing permission.
Failing permission. Explain how that actually works in our heads.
So, from a very young age, industrial-style education teaches us that the expert holds the answer. You're not taught to reason from basic principles. You're taught to memorize and execute approved procedures.
Right, so her internal monologue was likely, tape is the approved procedure. I executed the tape procedure. The procedure failed. Therefore, the task is impossible.
Exactly. She lacked the internal permission to experiment, to try a sideways approach. Just like your coworkers with the Excel macro, they wait for an IT expert instead of trusting their own capacity to reason through it.
So we have millions of intelligent adults walking around, trapped by these completely imaginary boundaries, terrified to just try a flat piece of tape. How do we even begin to break out of that mindset?
Well, the first step is recognizing the boundary for what it is. There's that classic metaphor about a captive baby elephant.
Oh, right. A trainer ties a young, weak elephant to a stake in the ground with a heavy rope.
And the baby pulls and pulls, but it can't break free. So eventually it just gives up.
But years later, that elephant grows into a massive, powerful animal that could uproot trees. But it's still tied to a small stake with a tiny rope, and it never even tries to escape.
Because it's held entirely by the memory of the boundary, not the physical reality of the rope.
We do that to ourselves constantly. We say, I'm not a math person, or I'm not creative, or I need a reason to be happy.
And that last one, needing a reason to be happy, that connects to a really fascinating detail in the source about laughter yoga.
Yeah, the observer notes that his wife requires a joke in order to laugh. She operates inside the emotional physics most of us are taught. You must have a logical trigger to justify laughter.
Right. Emotion is strictly a reaction to a stimulus, but with laughter yoga, you just bypass that entire cognitive process.
You don't need the joke. You just decide to initiate the state of joy directly. You force a fake chuckle, you make a silly noise, and your body's chemistry actually follows suit.
Your brain literally doesn't know the difference between a fake laugh and a real one. It pumps out endorphins either way.
You completely bypass that permission gate that demands a justified reason to feel good.
And when you realize you don't need a joke to laugh or permission to fix a monitor, you start seeing these imaginary ropes everywhere. Our society operates very much like a giant Skinner box.
Okay, let's unpack the Skinner box because that term gets thrown around a lot.
Yeah.
What is the actual mechanism there?
So B.F. Skinner was a psychologist who created an operant conditioning chamber, the Skinner box. Imagine a glass box with a rat inside.
Okay.
In the box, there's a lever. If the rat presses the lever, a food pellet drops in. The rat quickly learns to press the lever to get rewarded.
That makes sense.
But the box also has a metal grid floor that can deliver a mild electric shock to punish the rat for doing the wrong thing. Through this simple system of rewards and punishments, you can condition the rat to perform complex behaviors.
And modern society does the exact same thing to us. Think about your own life. What are your levers and pellets? A paycheck, a promotion, a good job from your manager.
And the electric shocks are a bad performance review, social ostracization, or getting fired. We're kept comfortable, but we're confined to the behaviors the system rewards.
Wow. Just think about the levers you pull every day to get your pellet. And the source actually touches on what happens when you decide to leave one of these massive overarching systems.
Yeah, the author writes about their personal experience of leaving their religion, which they describe as stepping out of the ultimate Skinner box.
Now, to be incredibly clear to you listening, we aren't endorsing or condemning any specific religious belief here. We're just impartially reporting the author's view. The focus is entirely on the psychological structure of these systems.
And the structural analysis is what matters. Leaving a highly structured belief system is an unmooring, terrifying experience.
The text expresses deep empathy for those who choose to stay inside. Because the box is warm. It provides cosmic reassurance, clear rules, a tight-knit community.
Exactly. Stepping out of that structure into the cold, unstructured air of total freedom is not something everyone is wired to handle. It's the ultimate act of testing the imaginary rope.
And testing ropes, by definition, causes friction. There's a brilliant observation in the deep dive about pushing back against bosses or questioning management in a corporate setting.
Right. The person doing the questioning often gets in trouble publicly. They get the electric shock from the system.
But afterward, in the hallway, their coworkers quietly pull them aside to say thank you.
The hallway thank you is the classic symptom of a highly conditioned environment.
I find this dynamic so interesting. Because when you respectfully question a flawed process or a bad decision from a boss, you aren't just being a rebel. You are acting as the room's pressure valve.
Pressure valve is a great way to describe it.
You're saying out loud the collective intelligence that the system forced everyone else to suppress to keep their jobs safe.
Because remember, these systems rely on a kind of collective sleepwalking to maintain their efficiency. When you test the rope, you disrupt the sleepwalking.
You show the other people in the room that the door to the Skinner box isn't actually locked.
But it also highlights why systemic ethics are so complicated. It is incredibly difficult for an individual to remain ethical when the surrounding system actively rewards silence and punishes truth-telling.
Right. If the entire slope of the corporate system tilts toward secrecy and expediency, it takes a massive amount of personal stamina to walk uphill against that moral gravity.
Sooner or later, most people just slide down the slope with everyone else. And that brings us to a crucial pivot in how we judge human behavior. We've been talking about everyday compliance. But what happens when we raise the stakes?
I always thought that adversity, like extreme stress, a massive life crisis, sheer desperation, is what strips away our polite masks and reveals who we really are deep down.
It is a very common and frankly very comforting myth. It allows people who have always lived in comfort to look at someone stealing food during a disaster and say, ah, look, that is their true malicious character coming out.
But the psychological reality completely refutes this, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The source argues adversity does not reveal your true nature, it reveals your biological limits.
Exactly. What is actually happening in your brain during a crisis? When you're starving or terrified or cornered, a massive biological shift happens.
Okay.
Your prefrontal cortex, the slow, energy-hungry part of your brain responsible for complex moral reasoning and empathy, essentially powers down.
It just goes offline.
Yep. The brain redirects all its energy to the amygdala, which is your primitive alarm system. Your behavior becomes entirely about survival triage. It's adaptive. You aren't showing the essence of your soul. You're just showing what your neurochemistry does to keep your body alive at all costs.
So it's not a moral failing, it's a physiological override. To explain this difference between environments, there's this incredible ecological metaphor in the document comparing the Arctic and the rainforest.
It's a striking contrast. Think about an Arctic ecosystem. The environment is defined by extreme scarcity and harsh freezing conditions.
The species that survive there are incredibly tough, highly specialized, and ruthlessly efficient. Because of that, the ecosystem has very low diversity. It's basically a boot camp optimized for survival.
Now look at a tropical rainforest. It's lush, wildly diverse, incredibly delicate, and deeply interdependent.
Like orchids and poison dart frogs. But neither environment is truer or better than the other, right? They're just adapted to completely different levels of friction.
Exactly. You wouldn't take a delicate rainforest orchid, drop it into the freezing Arctic tundra, watch it die in 5 minutes and say, I guess its true nature was just weakness.
No. Its nature simply required a stable, nutrient-rich environment to express its complex beauty. Adversity produces Arctic adaptations in humans' toughness, a very narrow range of behaviors, and survival-first thinking.
Safety, on the other hand, produces rainforest diversity, creativity, empathy, vulnerability, and art.
And this creates what we call signals of safety in our culture. Think about a beautiful crystal wine glass. It is elegant specifically because it is fragile. It can only exist in a society stable enough that accidentally breaking a glass isn't a financial catastrophe. Or look at high heels, or extremely long fingernails.
From a purely functional standpoint, they're terrible. They're entirely impractical.
But they act as rainforest traits. They signal to the world that the person wearing them is completely insulated from manual labor and physical danger.
In that context, fragility isn't a flaw, it's a luxury. It's a signal of surplus capacity and safety.
Okay, wait, this brings up a huge question for me. If a crisis just shows my biological limits and forces me into Arctic survival mode, how do I actually know if I or anyone else is a good person? What actually reveals our character?
Power. Power is the ultimate moral X-ray.
Because power removes the survival constraint.
Completely. When you're desperate, you have no choices. Your amygdala is running the show. But when you have power, and it doesn't have to be presidential power, it can just be the power of being a paying customer talking to a cashier, or a senior manager talking to an intern.
Right. Everyday power dynamics.
Yeah. When you have power, you suddenly have total safety and endless options. How you treat the person with less power than you, in that moment when you have the complete freedom to be either cruel or kind, is the true reflection of your character.
Because your behavior is no longer a strategic necessity for your own survival. You are finally expressing your actual values.
It's profound. Look at how people treat the waiter, right?
Yes. But it makes me wonder, if the rainforest environment is the ideal state for creativity and empathy, shouldn't we be aiming for a life with absolutely zero friction? Doesn't too much safety just make us hopelessly fragile? If safety brings out our best, shouldn't we protect ourselves from all adversity?
That is the trap of the overcorrection. It seems logical, but it ignores the biological need for resistance. A society absolutely needs its rainforest elements, but we cannot survive on zero friction.
Right.
Without any challenge or resistance, humans stagnate. We lose our resilience, and ironically, we actually regress.
It's the danger of excess safety. The document touches on codependency as a perfect example of this. It's what happens when you try to create a world with zero friction for someone else. Support completely replaces autonomy, and care replaces boundaries.
The biological equivalent of this is the greenhouse metaphor.
Oh, this was fascinating.
If you take a plant and put it in a perfectly controlled, heavily monitored greenhouse, it thrives at first. It looks incredibly healthy. But plants rely on wind resistance friction to trigger a process called thigmomorphogenesis.
Which is how they grow strong, thick stems. In the dead air of a greenhouse, the plant grows tall, but incredibly weak.
Right, if you take that plant outside, the first gentle breeze will snap it in half. Codependency feels like deep kindness, but it functions exactly like a greenhouse. It's a form of captivity that strips away the person's ability to survive reality.
You are protecting them so aggressively that you're actually destroying their capacity to stand on their own.
The goal isn't the freezing Arctic, and it isn't the smothered greenhouse. Healthy systems, whether we're talking about a marriage, a corporate team, or raising children, operate in what psychologists call the Goldilocks zone of optimal stress.
You have to provide just enough challenge and friction to spur growth, force adaptation, and build strong stems, while maintaining enough safety to prevent trauma and keep the amygdala from taking over.
Finding that balance is the trick to everything, isn't it?
It really is.
Yeah.
So if we look at the whole map of human behavior we've just laid out, adversity shows our biological limits. Safety shows our creative potential. But power is what truly shows our character.
Exactly.
And our entire goal in life is to navigate that narrow, difficult bridge between the brutal scarcity of the Arctic and the smothering artificial comfort of the greenhouse.
Navigating that bridge is the working definition of wisdom. The core takeaway from these decades of observation is that wisdom requires a long memory for these patterns. It's about knowing exactly when you need to tug on the imaginary rope and question the system. It's knowing when to offer a coworker a safe, friction-free space to try a new piece of tape without fear of failure.
And most importantly, it's knowing when to hold the powerful accountable, because that is where true character is forged.
It's about waking up to the systems that are actively shaping your daily choices. The door to your specific Skinner box might actually be unlocked. You just have to be willing to push against it to find out.
Exactly. So for you listening right now, I want you to take a hard look at the ropes in your own life. Are you stuck executing a miserable, clunky process at work just because you're waiting for an expert's permission to fix it? Are you holding back your own joy because you think you need a perfectly logical reason to laugh today? Or maybe are you judging someone's fundamental character based on how they acted during the absolute worst crisis of their life instead of watching how they behave when they hold all the cards?
It's a lot to process.
It is. And that brings me to one final provocative thought I want to leave you with. We've spent this time talking about physical and social systems, schools, offices, traditions that act as Skinner boxes, conditioning us with little rewards and shocks.
Yeah.
But think about your digital life. Think about the algorithms and AI feeds you interact with every single hour of the day. Are those feeds the ultimate modern Skinner boxes? Are they constantly feeding you microdoses of dopamine to keep you compliant, predictable, and incurious inside your own comfortable echo chamber?
Oh, wow.
Or can you find a way to hack those same digital tools to tug of your ropes, break out of your behavioral constraints, and actually grow your rainforest? Something to chew on the next time you're staring down a jammed printer or scrolling through a never-ending feed. Until next time.